Hey everyone, what a great day for another CISSP study group session. I'm B-Dubs, and seeing all of you here just makes my day. You know what I love about this community? Whether you're chasing that CISSP certification or just love expanding your cybersecurity knowledge, there's a place for you here. Your enthusiasm for learning is contagious, and I can't wait to dig into today's material with you. Speaking of material, we wrapped up Domain 1 last session covering objectives 1.9 to 1.12. And hey, if you're just joining us or missed a few sessions, no sweat. I've created a playlist to help you catch up. In fact, I'll drop that link in the chat right now. Today we're diving headfirst into Domain 2, which is all about asset security. And let me tell you, this domain is absolutely crucial. Why? Because at the end of the day, you can't protect something if you don't even know it exists, right? Today we're zeroing in on objectives 2.1, identify and classify information and assets, and 2.2, establish information and asset handling requirements. This is all about identifying your assets, classifying them based on how important they are, and then figuring out the right way to handle them. Sounds a bit formal, maybe, but trust me, we'll break it down and keep it interesting. Let's get started. So let's boil down asset security to its core. It's really about three things: know, classify, and protect. It's kind of like organizing your closet. You wouldn't toss your valuable, one-of-a-kind concert t-shirt in with your sweaty gym socks, would you? I sure hope not. You'd figure out what's what, group similar items together, and then put them away in the right place. That's exactly what we're doing with organizational assets, just on a much bigger, more important scale. It sounds simple, but think about a huge multinational corporation. They have tons of assets, and it can be like herding cats. But if you have a good plan, it will be much more manageable. Alright, let's jump right into Objective 2.1, identify and classify information and assets. This is where we put on our detective hats. Our mission, should we choose to accept it, and we do, is to find every single asset the organization owns and figure out just how valuable each one is to the business. Let's break down the asset security process into three key steps. First, we have to find all of our assets. This is asset discovery. Think of this as taking inventory of everything we own. We can use network scanning tools to find digital assets, conduct interviews with department managers, because sometimes the best information comes straight from the people managing these assets. And we review all of our purchasing records and contracts. We should maintain asset management databases and document these assets comprehensively. Next, we have to determine the value of these assets by performing a value assessment. This is where we figure out just how important each asset is to our business operations. We look at both tangible and intangible assets. Remember that sometimes the most valuable things aren't physical objects. We're talking about intellectual property, those valuable trade secrets, our customer relationships and data, our business processes, and even our human resources and their unique skill sets. What is all of this worth? Finally, we will assign classification levels. This is where we take everything we've learned about an asset and assign it the appropriate security level. We need to consider the CIA Triad here and provide ratings for the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all of our assets. And don't forget to always document your classification decisions. Trust me, you'll thank yourself later when you need to review or justify these decisions. Remember, this process must be thorough and systematic. Missing an asset or incorrectly classifying it can leave critical resources unprotected. There's a common mistake that many organizations make. They focus only on classifying data. But let me ask you, what valuable assets does your organization have that aren't data? Take a moment to think about that. Remember, an asset is anything that has value to the organization. Of course, this includes your data assets, like your customer databases, your financial records, or employee information. But your assets go far beyond just the data. There's hardware assets like your servers, manufacturing equipment, or security systems. we have software assets that may include custom applications, licenses, or source code. Then there's the intellectual property, which includes patents, trade secrets, or proprietary processes. And we have intangible assets like brand reputation, customer trust, or market position. Each of these needs its own classification approach. For example, misclassifying a critical manufacturing system could lead to inadequate physical security measures, while undervaluing brand reputation might result in insufficient PR crisis management protocols. That's why we need a comprehensive asset classification system and not just something that deals with data. The real foundation of this whole process is asset classification. Think of it like creating a rating system, a scale of importance for all your assets. We're going to give each asset a classification level that tells us how critical it is to the organization. This level then tells us exactly how we need to protect it. The higher the value, the more security we need. Simple as that. Let's think about a practical example. Let's say we've got a database with customer credit card information. That's obviously super sensitive stuff, right? So we'd classify it as confidential or maybe even restricted. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means that we need encryption when storing it, strict access controls, regular security audits, and secure methods for disposal when we don't need it anymore. Or think about public information, like your company's marketing materials. These are meant to be shared widely, so they might be classified as public. This means they can be distributed freely, but we still need to protect their integrity to prevent unauthorized modifications. Remember, every asset from the CEO's laptop to the cafeteria menu will need a classification. It's this systematic approach that helps us maintain security across the board. Now you might be thinking, why go through all this trouble? Why do we need to classify these assets? Well, there are some major benefits to classifying assets. First of all, it helps us pinpoint the critical information, the stuff that would seriously hurt the company if it got out. We call these the crown jewels. Think of these things like your customer payment database or that secret recipe that makes your product unique. Second, it helps us understand how sensitive data is to being changed. Some data must only be modified in very specific, authorized ways. For example, financial records might require dual authentication and detailed audit logs for any modifications. Third, it sends a clear message. This organization takes security seriously. Plus, it helps us meet regulatory requirements like GDPR, PCI DSS, or HIPAA, which often mandate specific classification levels for certain types of data. Finally, classification directly influences how we handle these assets throughout their lifecycle. When you know something is classified as confidential, you immediately know it needs encryption, strict access controls, and secure disposal methods. This is about helping the business run smoothly while keeping risk to a minimum. A super important and sometimes challenging part of this is figuring out who the asset owners are. The asset owner is the person who's ultimately accountable for the asset and making sure it's protected. Think of it like owning a car. You are accountable for locking it, getting insurance, and keeping it in good condition, even if you let someone else drive it for the day. And just like a car needs regular maintenance checks, assets need regular security reviews by their owners. Now, sometimes people try to avoid ownership. Oh, that data? That's not my problem. But that's where strong leadership comes in. The organization's higher-ups need to be very clear. Owners own their assets, period. This ownership should be formally documented, typically through an asset ownership agreement that clearly outlines responsibilities. There's a few best practices for asset ownership. We should document ownership in the asset inventory database. And additionally, we need to conduct periodic ownership reviews, especially with role or environment changes. And remember, security is there to support asset owners, not to take over their accountability. Now, the CIA Triad is fundamental to how we classify assets. It's not just about confidentiality. We need to consider all three of these pillars: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Let me break this down with some examples. For confidentiality, which represents sensitivity, we ask the question, how secret does this information need to be kept? For example, patient health records in a hospital must be strictly controlled, and only authorized healthcare providers should have that access. For integrity, which represents accuracy, we ask the question, how crucial is it that this data is accurate and has not been messed with? Think about financial transaction data, where even a small unauthorized change could have serious consequences. And for availability, which represents the criticality, we ask the question, how important is it that this asset is up and running when we need it? Emergency response systems, for instance, must be available 24/7 without fail. While a company's public blog might not impact the company at all if it's down for a short time. And here's the interesting part. These three components often need to be balanced against each other. For example, implementing stricter confidentiality controls might impact availability. The key is finding the right balance based on your asset's specific needs and the business context. We have to consider all these aspects to assign the appropriate classification. And remember, while all three components matter, their relative importance might vary depending on the type of asset you're dealing with. Okay, so we've been talking about this classification, but how do we actually do this thing? There's a step-by-step process. First is asset inventory. We need a complete, up-to-date list of everything the organization owns. This is like taking a full inventory of your entire house before you move. Every last item. And this isn't always easy, especially in large global corporations. Assets can be created internally, purchased, rented, or even acquired through mergers and acquisitions. So keeping that inventory current is an ongoing challenge. Second, we need to determine and assign ownership. For each and every asset, we have to identify and document the owner, the person who's ultimately accountable. Third, we classify the asset based on value. The owner, working with the security team, assigns a classification level based on the asset's value, considering the confidentiality, integrity, and availability aspects of the asset. Now, to avoid bias, because let's be honest, everyone thinks their assets are the most important. Many organizations use a classification committee or a working group. This brings together people from different departments to provide a more objective and consistent approach to asset classification. This process may also use a scoring system based on several factors that contribute to the asset's overall value to the organization. This helps owners understand the true value of their assets. Fourth, we protect and handle, meaning we apply the right security controls based on that classification level we just determined. Top secret stuff gets the highest level of protection, while public stuff will only get basic protection. And the fifth and final step is to assess and review. This is so important. Asset classification is not a one-and-done deal. We need to regularly review and update these classifications because the value of assets can change over time. Think of it as a regular security checkup for all your assets. Now guess what? That fifth step will lead us right back to step 1, asset inventory, because security is never done. As our organization evolves, as technology changes, and as new threats emerge, we need to keep cycling through this process. Think of it as a continuous improvement loop that helps us stay ahead of potential security risks. Let's go through a practical scoring matrix that helps us evaluate assets consistently. For each asset, we need to rate it from 1 to 5 across the entire CIA Triad. I have some examples of how this might look to score and classify your assets. First up is a customer payment database. Now think about this. It contains all your customers' financial data. So for confidentiality, we're giving it a solid 5. Why? Because if this data leaks, we're in serious trouble. Looking at integrity, it's another 5. We absolutely cannot afford any unauthorized changes to payment records. Even a small error could cause major problems with our customers' trust and our bottom line. For availability, we're looking at a 4. while it's crucial for business operations, we could probably handle very brief periods of downtime if it's absolutely necessary. When we add all this up, we're clearly looking at a restricted classification, our highest level of protection. Now let's contrast that with something completely different, our company blog. For confidentiality, it gets a 1 because, well, we want people to read it. It's meant to be public. Integrity is interesting here. We're giving it a 3. Why? Because while it's public content, we still need to control who can make changes. We don't want unauthorized people modifying our blog posts. And availability, that's a 2. Sure, we want our blog to be accessible, but if it's down for a short time, it's not going to crash our business. Adding this all up, we classify it as public. But remember, public does not mean unprotected. Let's look at another example, medical records. For confidentiality, that's a clear 5. We're dealing with protected health information, or PHI, which has strict privacy requirements under HIPAA. For integrity, it's also a 5. Even a small error in medical records could lead to serious consequences for patient care. A wrong medication dosage or incorrect diagnosis history could be life-threatening. And availability? That's another 5. In emergency situations, medical staff need immediate access to patient records to provide appropriate care. There's no room for downtime here. Adding all of these up, medical records definitely get a restricted classification. Finally, we have an example of something that might fall in the middle, our internal HR policies database. For confidentiality, it gets a 3. While it contains sensitive employee information, it's not as critical as financial or medical data. However, we still need to restrict access to authorized HR personnel and managers. For integrity, we're looking at a 4. The accuracy of HR policies is crucial for fair treatment of employees and legal compliance. Unauthorized changes could lead to serious workplace issues or legal problems. Availability gets a 3. While HR policies need to be accessible during business hours for decision-making and employee reference, brief periods of unavailability won't cause critical business disruption. This combination typically results in an internal use only classification, our middle tier of protection. Remember, while this framework provides a starting point, your organization's specific needs and regulatory requirements will influence how you implement this scoring system. Now let's talk about 2 important but distinct concepts in asset security: classification and categorization. While they might sound similar, they serve very different purposes. Classification is about building the security framework itself. Think of it like designing and building a filing cabinet. You decide how many drawers you need, what each drawer is for, and what security level each drawer requires. For example, you might create levels like top secret, secret, and confidential, and define exactly what each of these levels means. Categorization, however, is what we do with that framework. Going back to our filing cabinet, this is the actual process of examining each document and deciding which drawer it belongs in. When we use our scoring matrix to determine that a customer database belongs in the restricted category, that's categorization in action. We're taking a specific asset and placing it where it belongs in our predefined structure. So how do we go about naming and structuring these classification levels? The approach varies significantly between government and commercial sectors, each with their own unique requirements and terminology. Let's look at some examples of classification levels. In government settings, you'll see very standardized levels like top secret, secret, and unclassified. Each of these has specific, legally defined handling requirements. For instance, top secret information must be stored in approved facilities and requires special clearance for access. In the commercial world, we typically see labels like confidential, private, sensitive, and public. But here's something crucial to understand. These terms can mean different things in different organizations. A document marked confidential at one company might have a different handling requirement than at another. This is why it's absolutely critical to clearly document and communicate what each classification level means within your organization. Your security policies should spell out exactly what criteria qualify information for each level, who has authority to access information at each level, the specific handling requirements for each level, as well as the required security controls and protection measures. For example, in healthcare, protected health information, or PHI, might be classified as restricted, requiring encryption at rest and in transit, access logging, and strict authentication controls. In financial services, customer financial data might have similar restrictions, but different specific requirements based on regulations like PCI DSS. Remember, the goal isn't just to put labels on things. It's to ensure everyone in the organization understands exactly how to handle information at each classification level. But wait, speaking of labels, how do we make sure everyone understands what these classification levels are? That's a great question that brings us to our next slide here. Once we've classified and categorized all these assets, we need clear ways to communicate their classification levels. This happens through two distinct methods that work together: labeling and marking. You can find very specific meanings for each of these within the NIST SP 853A. First, with labeling, this is the machine-readable part, and it's how our systems identify and handle assets. Think of things like metadata tags in documents that specify classification levels, or file system attributes that trigger security controls, RFID tags or barcodes that systems can scan, or properties that DLP systems can use to enforce security policies. Then we have marking. This is the human-readable part. These are clear visual indicators telling people how to handle their assets. For example, headers and footers stating confidential, internal use only, or cover sheets with handling instructions, watermarks indicating classification level, or the standard warning labels on physical assets. The key here is consistency. Using standardized formats for both labels and marking helps prevent confusion and ensures proper handling across the organization. Your automated systems can read the labels to enforce security policies, while your people can quickly understand the markings to handle assets appropriately. Now that we've covered how to identify and classify our information assets, let's shift our focus to an equally important question. How do we actually handle these classified assets? The handling requirements we establish must directly align with and support the classification levels we just defined. This is Objective 2.2, which says to establish information and asset handling requirements. Classification tells us how important or sensitive an asset is, while handling requirements tell us exactly what to do with it based on that classification. These two concepts work hand in hand to create a comprehensive asset security framework. Think of this as creating a detailed instruction manual for how we handle our assets throughout their entire life cycle, from the moment they're created until they're finally disposed of. Imagine we have 3 documents. A public marketing brochure can be shared freely, and there's no special handling needed there. An internal financial report must be encrypted when we store it, and it can only be shared on the internal networks. And finally, customer credit card data must be encrypted at rest and in transit, so it requires strict access logging, and there are special disposal procedures required. Notice how the handling requirements become more stringent as the classification level increases. These requirements apply regardless of whether the information is on paper, in an email, or stored in a database. It's the classification that we defined before that determines how we handle it. Now let's break down one of the most important principles in asset handling, the concept that handling requirements follow the classification and not the media type. This breaks into 3 key points. First, classification drives the requirements. If we classify something as restricted, that classification sets specific rules about how we must handle that asset, period. Next, these requirements must be applied consistently across all media types, including digital formats like emails, databases, cloud storage, physical documents like printed materials and handwritten notes. removable media like USB drives and external hard drives, and mobile devices like phones, tablets, and laptops. And finally, there are no exceptions for convenience. For example, if restricted data requires encryption, we can't decide to skip encryption just because it's stored on paper instead of a computer. The rules follow the data, not the container. This might mean we need to use encrypted storage for data files, keep physical documents in locked cabinets, use secure courier services for transport, or even implement special disposal procedures. The key takeaway here is to protect your data based on its classification level, period. The same sensitive data needs the same rigorous protection, whether it's digital, printed, or carved in stone. Now, who exactly is in charge of protecting our assets? It all comes down to the asset owner. Think of an asset owner like a property manager of an apartment building. They have 5 main jobs. The first is access control. The owner determines who can access the asset and under what conditions. They're responsible for setting up and maintaining access rules, which determines who gets in and who doesn't. And they're also responsible for defining what authorized users can and cannot do with the asset. Next comes policy setting. The owner creates the roadmap for asset protection by developing clear guidelines for how the asset should be handled and ensuring these guidelines align with the asset's classification level. Risk management is also crucial here. The owner must conduct regular security assessments to identify vulnerabilities, then make informed decisions about how to address identified risks. Then, the maintenance of asset handling is always ongoing. The owner needs to perform regular reviews of security measures while also keeping policies and procedures up to date as circumstances change. Finally, we have team management. While the owner can delegate the day-to-day responsibilities to qualified team members, remember that they always retain ultimate accountability for the asset security. Now let's dive into another critical aspect of asset security: media handling. There are 3 key areas we need to understand when it comes to managing our information assets. First, let's talk about storage. This is all about where and how we secure our assets. The level of protection increases with sensitivity. For public data, we can use standard approved systems. Internal data requires both access controls and encryption. And for our most sensitive restricted data, we need both encryption and robust physical security measures. Then we have retention. Different regulations mandate different retention periods. In healthcare, HIPAA requires us to keep medical records for at least 6 years. For financial data, SOX mandates a 7-year retention period. PCI DSS has specific requirements for audit logs. You have to keep them for a year, but you have to have 3 months readily available. And then the IRS has varying retention requirements depending on the type of tax document. Finally, there's destruction. When it's time to dispose of assets, we need to understand the secure methods of disposal. For paper documents, we can use cross-cut shredding or pulping. Hard drives might require multiple pass wiping, degaussing, or physical destruction. Solid-state drives need specific secure erasure commands, or even physical destruction. The key point to remember with destruction is preventing data remanence. We don't want any recoverable data fragments left behind that could compromise security. Data remanence? What is that? Data remanence is another key concept in data security. This refers to that residual data that stays on storage media after you think you've deleted it. Think of it like a ghost of your data that refuses to disappear completely. This creates significant security risk because someone could potentially recover sensitive information you thought was gone. Let's talk about 2 main ways data can stick around after deletion. On the hardware level, you could be leaving behind physical remnants. When you delete files from magnetic storage like hard drives, fragments of data will often remain magnetically imprinted. With solid-state drives, data can lurk in unused blocks due to storage leveling and over-provisioning. Then in the software layer, you could be leaving behind digital footprints. Your operating system keeps various traces like file system journals and metadata, and programs create temporary files and cache data that might not get properly cleaned up. So now that we understand data remanence and its risks, let's take a look at the various tools and technologies organizations need to effectively implement these asset handling requirements throughout the lifecycle. There are 4 main categories of tools you'll need to know for the exam. First, we have encryption solutions. Every organization needs these. You'll want AES encryption to protect your data when it's sitting still. This is what we call data at rest. For data moving across networks, TLS protocols are essential here. And don't forget about key management systems. These are crucial for keeping track of all of your encryption keys. Next up is data loss prevention, or DLP. These systems act like security guards. Network DLP watches data as it moves across your network. Endpoint DLP protects data on individual devices. And nowadays, you need cloud DLP to secure your SaaS applications. There's also access control and monitoring. Identity and access management, or IAM tools, control who gets in. Then activity logging and monitoring tells you what they're doing once they're inside. Finally, we can't forget about data disposal tools. You need secure shredding equipment for physical documents, digital sanitization tools for electronic data, and certified disposal services for when you need professional help. Speaking of DLP, data loss prevention, or DLP systems, are essential for protecting sensitive data from unauthorized transmission. They function like vigilant security guards, monitoring all data movement for potential policy violations. DLP comes in 2 main flavors. First, we have network-based DLP. Think of this as having security cameras monitoring all the traffic moving through your network, watching every piece of data that tries to enter or leave. Then there's endpoint-based DLP, which is like having a security guard stationed at each device, keeping an eye on everything happening on that specific computer or phone. So how does DLP protect your data? Imagine someone accidentally trying to email credit card numbers to the wrong person. DLP catches that and it blocks it. Or maybe an employee attempts to upload sensitive company documents to their personal Dropbox. DLP steps in and prevents it. And if someone tries to copy patient health records to a USB drive without proper authorization, DLP can detect that too. DLP systems can be configured to take different actions when violations are detected, from simply alerting administrators to actively blocking the transmission. When you received a blocked email notification, that's your DLP system doing its job to protect sensitive information. Now that we understand how DLP systems protect our data by monitoring and controlling its movement, let's shift our focus to think about special handling requirements. Different types of sensitive data may require unique protection measures, and understanding these requirements is essential for maintaining effective security controls. First, let's look at personally identifiable information, or PII. This is data that can identify a specific person. You must encrypt this data whenever it's being transmitted or stored. Access controls need to be strict, and you need to monitor who's accessing this data. You'll also need to comply with privacy laws like GDPR in Europe and CCPA in California. Make sure you consult with your legal team to ensure you understand which privacy laws apply to you. Next up is healthcare information, also known as protected health information, or PHI. This falls under HIPAA regulations, and you'll need special procedures for handling and storing this data. Every time someone accesses this data, you should be tracking it in an audit trail. Then there's financial data, another critical category. If you're dealing with payment cards, you need to follow PCI DSS requirements. Your cardholder data will need to be encrypted and processed in secure environments. Like PHI, you need to maintain detailed logs of who's accessing this data and when. Finally, let's look at classified information. This is particularly important in government settings. People need specific security clearances to access this data. You can only handle this information in specially designated secure facilities. And when it's time to destroy this data, you might need to follow specific procedures. Here's the key point I want you to remember. All of these special handling requirements need to be clearly documented in your policies and procedures. And don't forget, you need regular audits to make sure everyone's following these requirements correctly. Alright, as we wrap up today's session on classification and asset security, I want to highlight the key concepts we've covered. First, we talked about the 3 core concepts of asset security. Think of these as your foundation. Know, or identification, it involves creating that comprehensive inventory of all your assets. You can't protect what you don't know you have. Classification is where you determine just how sensitive and valuable each asset is. This drives everything else. Finally, protection is where you implement controls based on that classification level. The higher the classification, the stronger the controls. Next, we covered what asset owners are responsible for. These are the people who really keep the wheels turning. They determine classification levels, set and maintain access controls, manage security policies, conduct those all-important risk assessments, and they maintain security measures day to day. Remember, they are ultimately accountable for the assets they own. And remember our golden rule: classification drives protection. This means that your security controls must always match classification levels. No exceptions. These requirements apply whether your asset is digital, physical, or in transit. And we never make exceptions just because it's convenient. When it comes to asset lifecycle security, you need to think about secure storage methods that align with sensitivity levels, retention requirements that are often mandated by regulations, as well as proper destruction methods to prevent data remanence. Finally, we covered some of the security tools and technologies you might use, including DLP systems to prevent data leaks, encryption solutions to protect sensitive data, access control systems to manage who gets in, and secure destruction methods when it's time to say goodbye to that asset. Alright, that wraps up today's topics on exam objectives 2.1 and 2.2. Remember, you can always go back and rewatch sections, pause, and take notes. These sessions will remain on YouTube so you can watch them anytime. I also go back to each one after the live stream to add chapters so you can easily visit certain topics. The key here is to understand the concepts and not just memorize the details. Think about how these principles apply in real-world scenarios. And don't forget that managerial perspective. Now it's time to start the after party. We'll all move over to the Study GRC Discord server and join the CISSP voice channel for open discussion and answer any questions you have. Don't miss this part. Not only can you dive into deeper discussion within a community, but you might even make some new friends. I also will be sharing these slides in our Discord after every session. If you're not in the Discord yet, you can go to cissp.brittwhite.io for the Discord link. And don't forget to grab your CISSP role when you join. That way you can find the right channels. Next time, we'll be continuing Domain 2 and Asset Security during our live session on Tuesday, March 25th at 6 p.m. Central US time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Discord.